Quick story. One day I was leaving the house and I stepped out into the garage, hit the garage door open. And I did the 3-point check. You know what that is? That's this, the wallet, keys, phone. And I was missing something, so I popped back inside to grab what I was missing, came back out into the garage, shut the door behind me, and as soon as I did, suddenly right there in front of me was the biggest dog I've ever seen in my life. And I was cornered. The biggest dog I've ever seen. And I stood still, and he stood completely frozen in place. He was jet black, and his eyes were staring right into mine. And he was such a good boy. Oh, what a good boy. What a good boy. But for a few seconds there before I knew what a good boy he was, all I could say was, gulp. Because if he had been aggressive, if he had been territorial over that garage, I would have had to defend myself. Have you ever been intimidated by a large dog? I'll admit, I was a little bit scared. Another quick story. A friend of mine said that one time he was ridge running in Alaska. Now, ridge running, that's a total brag. That sounds like a brag, doesn't it? Because anytime I've ever hiked up a mountain to a ridge, all I could do is catch my breath, and he's running. Total brag. So anyway, he's running along, and there, about 30 yards in front of him on the trail, is a black bear. He freezes. Meanwhile, the bear charges straight at him. Now, he fumbles for his bear spray, and right before the bear gets to him, he takes a hard right and disappears. Gulp. Right? Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever been face to face with a large, scary, dangerous animal? Or a bee? Anyone afraid of bees? Listen, I told that story in the first service, and right afterward, 13-year-old Nate came up to me and showed me a picture of the mountain lion that was stalking him. Okay, I was outdone. I have a big dog, and a 13-year-old has a mountain lion, so he had the topper. But has that ever happened to you? Now imagine that the animal was a lion. Nate can imagine that the animal was a lion. Not just one lion, but a den of lions. Lions kept hungry for one purpose: to eat people. Well, today we're going to talk about Daniel and the lion's den. And it's a great story. It's a memorable story. Every children's Bible, every picture Bible, children's picture Bible, has Daniel and the lion's den. You know it's true. So if you recall, the short version of Daniel and the lion's den goes like this. Daniel was a man who was faithful to God. But they made a decree, a law, that established that anyone for 30 days, they were only allowed to pray to the king. They could pray to no other god. They could only pray to King Darius for 30 days. And if you broke that law, then you would end up in the lion's den. So when Daniel heard about this, he opened his windows, prayed out loud to the God of heaven and earth, the one true God, Yahweh, Israel's God, the God that we worship. And when they caught him doing this, they arrested him and threw him into the lion's den. And spoiler alert, God saw Daniel's faithfulness, sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel was saved. Daniel was saved because he defied that unjust law. Daniel was saved because he was a man of no compromise. Or was he? Well, there's more to Daniel than that, and there's more to the story than that. So let's go back and look at where Daniel came from. Daniel chapter 1 tells us this. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. And then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So, Babylon attacked Judah and carried off the best of the best from the king's household and the nobility. Daniel was one of those from Judah. He was from Judah. And he was among the best of the best, not just from Judah, but he was a VIP. He was a person of importance and privilege. So I want you to imagine what it was like for Daniel and the others that were taken into captivity. One day, you're living in or near the palace of the king of Judah, and life is pretty good. And the next day, you're attacked and overthrown. And then you're taken from your home and from your family, from your way of life, everything you've ever known, and you're told you're now going to serve the king of the kingdom that just invaded yours. The kingdom that just killed people you knew, forced you to leave. And then imagine, after all of that, to then be forced to attend the University of Babylon, where their intention was to indoctrinate you into Babylonian culture. See, it wasn't just enough for Babylon to overpower the other nations and defeat them with the sword. They wanted to assimilate you and make you one of them and serve their interests. And they even changed their names. They gave them Babylonian names. In verse 7, it says, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. And Daniel's new name, Belteshazzar, was a name associated with King Nebuchadnezzar's God. I mean, can you imagine the trauma of all of that? On top of everything else, to be given the name of a false god. What would you do? What would you do if that were you? Would you go along with it? Or would you defy the situation? Would you defy these new orders? Or would you agree to learn from and work for your enemy? Well, let's look at how Daniel maneuvered it. Verse 8, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Aha, there you have it. Resistance, defiance, no compromise. Not exactly. See, what it says here is that Daniel didn't want to defile himself with the royal diet. You see, Babylon took the best of the best from Judah, but they also provided the best of the best for them from Babylon. They were given the best food and drink. I mean, they were eating the same food that the king ate. The problem was, for Daniel and his friends, is that this wasn't kosher. You see, part of the Jewish lifestyle and worship was to avoid eating certain foods deemed unclean. So, no pork, no lobster, no shrimp. I mean, those are 3 good reasons not to convert to Judaism right there. But above all that, no food that had been sacrificed to false gods. So this tells us that Daniel was a faithful follower of God. And it says here, he asked permission of the chief official. And permission is not exactly defiance. May I please is not the same as no way, Jose. And listen to what it goes on to say. It says in verse 9 that God caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Now, it gives God credits for giving Daniel favor with this official. But Daniel, had he been defiant to the official? Had he been uncompromising? Had Daniel fought back at everything that was happening to him? If Daniel had been a jerk toward this official, do you suppose that he would still show him favor? I mean, it would be understandable that Daniel was angry toward what was being forced upon him. For all of us, sometimes something's taken away that we've just always taken for granted. And we can have the tendency, if we're not careful, to live in the past. We can live stuck in anger and bitterness over the unfair hand that we've been dealt. But you can't live well and move forward well stuck in what was and what was lost. Sometimes you just have to accept the current reality and do your best from where you are moving forward. And Daniel recognized Judah was gone. Judah was gone. He was in Babylon now. And his path forward meant navigating his current reality well. And for God to have given Daniel favor with the chief official, Daniel had to put himself in a position to receive that favor. In order to get God's blessing, most often we need to partner with God and place ourselves in a situation where we can receive it. And we see that Daniel wasn't willing to defile himself before God, but he did become compliant and agreeable to Babylon whenever he could. Not just compliant, but he applied himself to the work that was forced upon him. He worked hard at it. And listen to the result in verse 18. It says, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with him, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of the whole kingdom. See, Daniel and his friends didn't just comply agreeably. They worked hard. They applied themselves and became star pupils at Babylon University. They made the dean's list. They graduated with honors. Now, you might be wondering, where's the lions and the den? Well, when do we get to that? Well, the lion's den happens in chapter 6, which is years later. This years after King Nebuchadnezzar had lived and died, and his son Darius took the throne. So I wanted to give some background before we go there, and now that we've done that, let's go there. Chapter 6, verse 1. It says, it pleased Darius, King Darius, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. One of them was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself from among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel moved past cooperation to full participation. And he did this so with such excellence that the king was going to put him in charge of the entire kingdom. But not everyone liked the idea that this foreigner was going to rule over them. Verse 4, it says, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they were looking for a way to trap Daniel to get rid of him. And folks, we really have to use our imagination to relate to Daniel here. Because I doubt there's many, if any of us in this room who have ever been through anything like that. But I want you to think about this, because we live in a culture where from an early age we're programmed to pursue our preferences. We pursue our preferences. I mean, isn't that the American dream, that we can pursue work that we enjoy, money to own a nice house someday, money to travel, opportunities for our children? I mean, what kind of life are you pursuing? Are we not motivated by our preferences? Now, I know a lot of you in this room grew up around here. You grew up in the Black Hills. But I've talked to several people that grew up elsewhere. You're from somewhere else. You came to the Black Hills. You fell in love with the Black Hills and you wanted to stay. Because what's not to love about the Black Hills? So your preferences brought you here. It's a great place to live. But Daniel didn't have the luxury of living a life where his preferences mattered at all. I mean, his preferences died the day that Judah was destroyed. Yet he conducted himself with the utmost integrity. He was an ethical man who did the right thing at every single step. You know, there are a lot of people in this world that want to force the world to fit their preferences, or even to fit what they believe is right. But Daniel shows us that even when the world isn't set right, we can still live ethically and prosper. And we can honor God despite our surroundings. So, out of their jealousy for Daniel, these satraps, they convinced King Darius to declare a law that anyone who prays to anyone or anything other than Darius for 30 days, that they be thrown into the lion's den. And they did this because they knew that Daniel faithfully prayed to the God of heaven and earth. And Darius, unaware of this, agreed to force people to pray only to himself. You see, they trapped Darius through his ego in order to trap Daniel through his faithfulness. Look at verse 10. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he'd done before." And you might say, there's the defiance. There is the stand that Daniel made. But Daniel didn't pray out of defiance. He didn't pray out of rebellion to an unfair law. Daniel prayed out of faithfulness to his God. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he'd always done. I know we're Protestants, and that word protest is built right into our name. But the moment our piety becomes protest, it ceases to be sincere devotion to God. Daniel's prayers weren't protest, they were praise. Daniel was faithful to pray before the decree, and he was unhindered in the face of it. And the reason he was easily trapped wasn't for what Daniel protested against, but it was what Daniel stood for, which was sincere devotion to Yahweh. Folks, I think it's fair to say that we live in a harshly divided culture of us versus them, where no one wants to compromise anything. But Daniel compromised a lot. He answered to a Babylonian name associated with a false god. He served the nation that conquered his own, and he went along with it so well that he was awarded for his good work within that system. There were a lot of hills Daniel was not willing to die on. And do you recognize the more hills we're willing to die on, the more likely we are to die on a hill? Daniel had only one hill he was not, that only one hill he was willing to die on. And that was anything that prohibited his own devotion and his own faithfulness to God. And that was it. I mean, in the face of being put in this culture, the only thing that he was undeterred at was his devotion to God. And in the face of being thrown into a den of hungry lions, he chose to remain faithful. Sadly, I've known people who have compromised their integrity, the integrity of their faith, to fight for their preferences. But Daniel compromised all his preferences, but held on to his integrity, and he remained faithful to the Lord. And that got him thrown into the lion's den. King Darius didn't want to do it. He liked Daniel. He valued him. But he himself approved the decree. And to save face, he had to go through with it. So now let's read how the end of the story comes about. Verse 16, it says, "So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God whom you serve continually rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, whom you serve continually, has your God been able to rescue you from the lions?' Daniel answered, 'May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty.' The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted his God." It's a great story. God's faithfulness shown to those who follow him faithfully. A miraculous rescue that can only be explained by supernatural means. A man so committed to God that he was willing to be thrown to the lions. But it's not a story of a man who never compromised. See, Daniel learned to be compliant whenever he could in a world that did not match his preferences. And we can learn a lot from Daniel, because we live in a world that won't always match our preferences. And no matter how we might try, we are going to live in a world that will not be set right until Jesus returns. And that means that we will live in moments that we are not comfortable in. We will be surrounded by a culture that we don't relate to. But Daniel shows us, in the face of whatever we may face, that we can hold on to our integrity. He shows us to choose wisely when and where and why we resist. But he shows us how to remain faithful to that which is essential, to not defile ourselves with the attitudes and the behaviors and the ways of this current cultural flow, and to hold tight to Jesus through it all.